The rain hammered against the cracked pavement of Riverside Street like the sky itself was weeping for a city that had long stopped caring. Daniel Cole pulled his worn jacket tighter around his shoulders, his breath fogging in the cold November air, when he heard it, a voice so fragile, so broken, that it stopped him mid-step. "We haven't eaten in days," the woman whispered, her words trembling not from cold alone, but from a shame so deep it seemed to hollow out her very bones. Daniel turned, and what he saw would change the course of his life forever. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the quiet power of one person's compassion to change everything, hit that like button, drop a comment below, share this story with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Golden Outlaw Tales so you never miss a story like this one. The woman sat huddled beneath the awning of an abandoned laundromat, her clothes soaked through, clutching a small boy no older than 5 against her chest, as though her own body could shield him from the entire cruel world. The child's lips were pale, his eyes sunken with the particular exhaustion that only hunger brings, a hunger that steals the light from a child's face far too soon. Daniel had walked this street 1,000 times before, always in a hurry, always consumed by his own quiet battles. But something about the way this woman held her son, the way her voice cracked on those 5 words, rooted him to the spot like he'd been struck by lightning. He was no stranger to hardship himself. 3 years earlier, Daniel had been a mid-level accountant at a firm downtown, married to a woman he adored, with a modest home and a life that felt, if not extraordinary, at least stable. Then the diagnosis came. His wife's illness, sudden and merciless, drained not only her strength, but every dollar they had saved. The medical bills piled higher than the hope they clung to, and when she passed, Daniel was left with nothing but grief and a mountain of debt that swallowed the house, the car, and eventually, the job he could no longer focus on. He had learned, in the cruelest way possible, what it meant to lose everything. And perhaps that was exactly why, when he looked into this stranger's eyes, he didn't see a beggar on the street. He saw a reflection of his own devastation staring back at him through the rain. He crouched down slowly, careful not to startle her, and asked her name. She hesitated, as though even sharing that small piece of herself was a risk she couldn't afford to take. Eventually, in a voice barely above a whisper, she told him she was called Maria, and the boy in her arms was her son, Eli. She explained, haltingly, broken by shame and cold, that she had lost her job at the textile factory 2 months prior when it shut its doors without warning, and the small apartment she'd rented had been reclaimed when she couldn't make rent. Since then, she and Eli had been sleeping wherever they could find shelter, bus stations, church steps, the backs of abandoned buildings, surviving on whatever scraps of charity or luck came their way. But luck, it seemed, had abandoned them entirely these past several days, and hunger had become their only constant companion. Daniel felt something crack open inside his chest, an old wound reopening alongside a strange, unfamiliar warmth. He thought of his late wife, of how she used to say that the measure of a person wasn't in what they gathered for themselves, but in what they were willing to give away when it cost them something real. He reached into his jacket pocket, and his fingers closed around the only thing of value he carried that day, his wallet, containing the last $83 he had to his name, money meant to last him through the rest of the week, money for his own single room above a hardware store, money he could not truly afford to lose. And yet, without a second thought, he placed the entire wallet into Maria's trembling hands. She stared at him, disbelief washing over her rain-streaked face, insisting she couldn't accept something so large, that surely he needed it himself. But Daniel only shook his head and told her, with a steadiness that surprised even him, that he had learned the hard way that money could be replaced, but a mother's ability to feed her child could not wait. He told her there was a diner 2 blocks down, still open, still warm, and that she should take Eli there immediately before the boy caught his death in this cold. For a long moment, Maria simply wept, not the quiet tears of someone accepting charity, but the full, shaking sobs of someone who had forgotten, in the desperate scramble of survival, that strangers could still be kind. What Daniel didn't tell her, what he could barely admit to himself, was that giving her that money meant he would go hungry that night, that he would walk back to his tiny room with an empty stomach and an emptier wallet, uncertain of how he would manage the week ahead. But as he watched her scoop Eli into her arms and hurry toward the warm glow of the diner's sign in the distance, something inside him settled, a peace he hadn't felt since before his wife's illness, since before the world had taught him that kindness was a luxury few could afford. He told himself it was enough, that he had done what needed doing, and he turned to walk away into the rain, never once expecting that this single act of generosity was only the beginning of a story far larger than he could have imagined. The days that followed were the hardest Daniel had faced since his wife's passing. He rationed what little food remained in his cupboard, a half loaf of bread, a few cans of soup, stretching them thin across a week that felt endless. He picked up whatever odd jobs he could find, hauling boxes at a warehouse for a few hours here, shoveling snow from a neighbor's walkway there, anything to keep himself afloat. He never once regretted giving Maria that money. If anything, the memory of her face, of the boy's small hand gripping her coat, became the quiet fuel that kept him moving through his own hardship. He didn't know if he'd ever see them again, and some nights, staring at the water-stained ceiling of his room, he wondered if Maria and Eli had found somewhere safe, somewhere warm, or if the world had simply swallowed them back into its indifference. 2 weeks later, on a gray Tuesday morning, Daniel was walking to the temp agency office where he'd been checking in daily for work when a voice called his name from across the street. He turned, startled, and saw Maria hurrying toward him, dressed in a clean coat he didn't recognize, her hair combed, her cheeks no longer hollow with hunger. Beside her, Eli ran ahead, laughing, his small sneakers splashing through puddles with the carefree joy only children seem able to summon regardless of circumstance. Daniel could hardly believe the transformation before him, and before he could ask a single question, Maria was already explaining, breathless with excitement, that the diner owner, a kind, older woman named Rosalind, had overheard her story that rainy night and offered her a job on the spot, waitressing during the day while Eli stayed in the back with Rosalind's granddaughter, who ran a small daycare from the same building. Maria explained that the job had come with something even more precious than a paycheck: stability. Rosalind had connected her with a housing assistance program through the church down the street, and within days, Maria and Eli had moved into a small but clean one-bedroom apartment above a bakery, paid partly through her wages and partly through the program's support. She told Daniel, her eyes brimming with tears again, that none of it, not the job, not the apartment, not even the small dignity of waking up each morning with a roof over her son's head, would have happened if he hadn't stopped that night, if he hadn't given away money he clearly could not spare. She had thought about him every single day since, praying she would somehow cross paths with him again just to say thank you properly, and now, standing before him on this ordinary gray morning, she finally could. Daniel, overwhelmed, admitted quietly that the weeks since had been difficult for him too, that he'd been scraping by on odd jobs and the goodwill of a few sympathetic neighbors. Maria's expression shifted instantly from gratitude to determination. She insisted he come with her to the diner that very afternoon, telling him that Rosalind was looking for extra help in the kitchen and that she'd already mentioned his name, hoping fate might bring them together again so she could return the kindness in whatever small way she could. Daniel hesitated, pride tugging at him the way it often does with people and used to receiving help rather than giving it. But Maria took his hand, the same hand that had once placed a wallet into hers, and told him that allowing someone to help you back wasn't weakness. It was simply letting kindness complete its full circle. That afternoon, Daniel walked into Rosalind's diner for the first time, greeted by the smell of fresh coffee and simmering broth, and by a woman whose warm, knowing smile suggested she'd already heard every detail of what happened that rainy night. Rosalind offered him a position in the kitchen without hesitation, telling him that anyone capable of a sacrifice like his was exactly the kind of person she wanted working under her roof. Over the following months, Daniel found not just steady work, but something he hadn't realized he'd been missing: a sense of belonging, a found family stitched together from strangers who had each weathered their own storms. He and Maria became close friends, their bond forged in that single desperate night, deepening through shared shifts, shared meals, and the quiet understanding that only comes from two people who have each stood at the very edge of losing everything. Eli, too, grew fond of Daniel, often waiting by the diner's back door each afternoon for him to finish his shift so they could walk home together, the boy chattering endlessly about his day, while Daniel listened with the kind of patient attention he hadn't realized he'd missed offering to someone. Slowly, without either of them quite noticing the exact moment it happened, the three of them became something resembling a family, not through blood, but through the simple, steady accumulation of showing up for one another day after day. Rosalind would often watch them from behind the counter, smiling to herself, telling other customers that some of the strongest families in this world are the ones built not by chance, but by choice, and by someone brave enough to give everything they had when it mattered most. If this story touched your heart even a little, if it reminded you that kindness can still change lives in a world that often feels too cold for it, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it today, and subscribe to Golden Outlaw Tales so we can keep bringing you stories like Daniel's. And before we close this chapter, I want to ask you something special. Please, in the comments below, share one word that describes what kindness means to you. I'll be reading through every single one. Daniel never once thought of that rainy night as a sacrifice. In the years that followed, as he watched Eli grow, as he stood beside Maria at her graduation from the community college night classes she eventually enrolled in, as he found in Rosalind's diner not just a job but a home, he understood that he hadn't lost $83 that night at all. He had planted something far more valuable, a seed of trust in a world that had given him every reason to stop believing in people, and in return, that seed had grown into a family, a purpose, and a life rebuilt not despite his hardship, but because of the courage he found within it to give when he had almost nothing left to give.